There's something I've been thinking about lately, and something I've had conversations with in this podcast, and also as questions from you listeners. How different sex can actually feel, depending on the situation, the connection, the emotional state we're in. Not just physically, but emotionally, energetically, even existentially. I think many of us grow up learning sexuality as a release, pressure, tension, performance, a quick way to feel relief, to feel content. And there's nothing wrong with that. The body sometimes needs release. Sometimes sex regulates stress. And sometimes masturbation is simply comfort, relaxation, or a way to reconnect with yourself for a moment. I don't think this is about judging any of that. I think most of us need this sometimes. I know I do. But I've started realizing there's another layer too. I've talked a lot in earlier episodes of 34O about slowing down, about presence, about what happens when we stop rushing through ourselves and each other. Because there's a completely different experience that begins to emerge when you slow down. When sex stops being something you do and becomes a place you enter. I've noticed this especially during periods of my life where intimacy has felt deeply present, safe, mutual, unrushed. Something changes in the body then. Time changes. A whole weekend can suddenly feel like a single moment, like an hour that just disappears, or somehow like a lifetime. You stop performing, stop chasing, stop thinking so much. You start feeling instead. I've noticed that my own body responds completely differently in those moments. Desire becomes stronger, not weaker, and presence deepens. The body relaxes and becomes more alive at the same time. Even outside the bedroom, something changes. More creativity, more energy, more calm, more openness. Almost like the nervous system finally exhales. And I think that's what I want to explore today. The difference between release and truly meeting yourself through intimacy. Let's start with looking at release versus presence. There's a difference between releasing tension and truly meeting someone. And I think this is where I want to begin, because I don't believe release is wrong. Sometimes the body genuinely needs it. Stress builds up, tension builds up, life becomes overwhelming. Sex can calm us. Masturbation can calm us. Orgasm can regulate the nervous system for a while. I think most people recognize that feeling. For years, I thought I knew the difference between release and presence. I really didn't. I had the words, the intellectual knowledge, but the body hadn't really caught up yet. And what I've come to see is this. Release and presence are not the same experience. One removes pressure, the other creates connection. And sometimes we confuse the two. I know I have. Especially in periods of life where everything moved fast. Work, stress, expectations, constant stimulation. It becomes easy to approach sexuality the same way. Fast input, fast release, temporary relief. Almost like scratching an itch. But slowing down changes something. Because when you're truly present with another person, sex stops being only about tension leaving the body. It starts becoming about feeling. Feeling yourself. feeling another person, feeling time slow down, feeling safe enough to stop performing for a moment. And I honestly think many people rarely experience that. Not because something is wrong with them, but because modern life trains us into acceleration, faster communication, faster dopamine, faster relationships, faster expectations. We rarely stay anywhere long enough to fully arrive, including inside ourselves. I've lost things to that pace. Relationships that needed slowness I didn't have. Conversations that needed silence I couldn't sit in. I'm not nostalgic about it. I'm just honest about it right now. I've been reading Sex at Dawn by Casilda Yeta and Christopher Ryan lately. I don't agree with all of it in that book. Some of it is quite provocative, and some probably quite oversimplified. But it left me thinking about how disconnected modern sexuality has become from presence itself. And sometimes I wonder if the nervous system simply struggles to keep up. I've touched on this before, especially in the episode Beyond Polarization, because some of the deepest intimacy I've experienced had very little to do with novelty and everything to do with presence. So, what about the different layers of sexuality? Primal, mechanical, emotional, and present. I think sexuality really exists in many different layers. Not all sex feels the same emotionally or physiologically. There are many different types, kinks, variations, dynamics. I'm deliberately not going through all of them here in this episode, but I'll simplify into 4: primal, mechanical, emotional, and just being present. One thing to say up front: these aren't really separate categories. They're more like currents that sort of blend. Primal sex can also be deeply present. Emotional sex can also be very primal. What changes from moment to moment isn't really which kind it is, it's in which currents it's dominating. So sometimes sex is very primal, raw, hungry, intense, almost instinctive. Two bodies colliding with passion and desire. And honestly, there's something beautiful and very powerful in that too. When you feel connected to something primal in yourself. Sometimes we need intensity, fire, losing ourselves for a moment. Other times, sex becomes more mechanical, more familiar patterns, habit, release. Not necessarily all bad, but sometimes disconnected and just not really there. Almost like the body's present while something deeper stays guarded. And sometimes not present at all. The mind might be somewhere else entirely. Do you recognize yourself? I think many long-term relationships drift into that space at times. People care for each other, but stop truly meeting each other. And then there's emotional intimacy, where sexuality becomes softer, slower, more vulnerable, where eye contact suddenly matters, presence matters, safety matters, where being fully seen almost becomes more intimate than the act itself. And I think the deepest experiences often contains pieces of all of these layers. The primal, the emotional, the playful, the sensual. Not performance, but aliveness. Because sexuality, at least to me, becomes most powerful when the body, emotions, and nervous systems are no longer separated from each other, when desire and presence begin to move together. So, what happens in the body when we think about the nervous system, safety, and slowing down? So, one thing I've become increasingly fascinated by is how much safety affects the body, not just emotionally, but physically. I think many people underestimate that because we often talk about desire as if it's only visual or hormonal or purely instinctive. But the nervous system plays such a huge role. When stress is high, when pressure is high, when we're anxious, distracted, or emotionally guarded, the body responds differently. Sometimes desire decreases completely. Sometimes sexuality becomes more mechanical, more goal-oriented. These days, when I begin to slow down with someone, I notice my jaw releasing before anything else. I didn't know my jaw had been holding anything. That's how subtle the armor can be. So when safety enters the room, something shifts. The body softens, breathing changes, eye contact changes, touch changes. The body paradoxically becomes both more relaxed and more alive at the same time. I've experienced that myself. Desire becoming stronger through closeness instead of weaker. Presence deepening instead of fading. And honestly, I think this is why some experiences of intimacy stay with us for years. Because it's not just the sex itself we remember. It's the feeling of finally exhaling with another human being. Of not needing to perform, not needing to impress, not needing to rush. Just being there, fully. So when a whole weekend can feel like a single moment, it's sort of really described best as time changes. This part is difficult to explain unless you've experienced it, but I think a lot of people have. Those moments where time almost disappears, where a whole evening suddenly feels like an hour, or where an entire weekend somehow feels outside normal reality. I've noticed this especially in moments of deep presence, not only during sex, but in everything surrounding it too. Lying close, skin to skin, talking, laughing, falling asleep together, waking up slowly, making coffee, and touching without urgency. Something happens to time right there. Or maybe more accurately, something happens to us. We leave the constant mental noise for a while. The planning, the pressure, the self-consciousness, and we enter experience instead. I think that's why deeply present intimacy can feel almost healing sometimes. Not because it removes pain from life, but because for a few moments we stop fighting ourselves so much. So, what about orgasm versus pleasure? Orgasm and pleasure are not always the same thing. I think this is another important distinction, because many of us grow up believing orgasm is a goal. We're conditioned to perform and deliver orgasm, the finish line, the proof that the experience was successful. Especially as men, I think many of us are conditioned into that mindset very early. performance, result, completion. Women carry their own conditioning around this too. Different shape, same gravity. But over time, I started noticing something else. Orgasm and pleasure are not always the same thing. Orgasm can happen very quickly, sometimes almost mechanically. The body knows exactly what to do, especially with fast stimulation, fast movement, fast release. But pleasure, real pleasure, often moves differently. It expands instead of explodes. It lingers, deepens, spreads through the body. And strangely enough, I think slowing down often intensifies pleasure instead of reducing it. Not because everything becomes perfect, but because you begin feeling more. More touch, more breath, more subtlety, more connection. If you want to experience it for yourself, take a deep breath, slow down, put your phone away, make time. Be in the now with your partner and with yourself. When I do, something different happens. Sometimes orgasm becomes part of that. Sometimes several times. And sometimes it's almost becomes secondary to the experience itself, to the feeling of being deeply present with another person. And from my own experience, I can say that desire, lust, passion grow even stronger when orgasm isn't the goal, but being present, enjoying, being alive with another person. I think many people secretly long for that. Not only intensity, but depth. So, what about the erotic energy as a life force? I see this as one of the main reasons why people begin to glow. One thing I've become more aware of is really how intimacy affects life outside the bedroom, too. Because honestly, I don't think sexuality is isolated from the rest of who we are. At least not when it's deeply present. I've noticed periods in my life where intimacy felt alive, safe, and emotionally open. And something changed in me outside of sex, too. More creativity, more energy, more calm, more openness toward life itself. Almost like something in the nervous system wakes up again. And I think many people recognize this, even if they rarely talk about it openly. Some people begin to glow when they feel emotionally and physically alive. Their eyes change, their presence changes, their energy changes. Not in a performative way, more in the sense that they suddenly feel connected again to themselves, to their body, to desire, to life. I don't think erotic energy is only about sex. I think it's deeply connected to creativity, playfulness, curiosity, and emotional openness too. I mean, maybe that's why sexuality can feel so powerful sometimes. Because at the deepest level, it's not only about orgasm, it's about aliveness, and it's a true life force. So, coming back to yourself, maybe that's really what this episode has been about. Not sex as performance, not sex as technique, not sex as achievement, but intimacy as presence, intimacy as nervous system, intimacy as safety, intimacy as slowing down enough to actually feel. I think many of us spend so much of life disconnected from ourselves, rushing, performing, distracting ourselves, moving through life from the neck up. And sometimes intimacy becomes one of the few places where we briefly return to the body again, where time softens, where defenses lower, where we stop trying so hard to be everything. Maybe that's why deeply present intimacy can feel almost healing. Because for a few moments, we're no longer performing life. We're inside it, fully. So maybe the real question isn't only how we have sex. Maybe the deeper question is, can we slow down enough to truly meet ourselves? And from there, truly meet another human being? Ultimately, sex and intimacy are something we all desire. In all my conversations, I don't think I've ever met anyone who wanted to have a bad sex life. A key element in maintaining a healthy sex life over time is curiosity. Stay curious, explore, talk, and communicate with your partner. All the layers I went through here, without going into kinks and variations, are needed, most welcome. Combining them, depending on the situation and the mood. A particular moment might require a new approach. Be open to it. Doing it the same way over and over again makes it mechanical. And when it becomes mechanical, you're not really present with yourself or with your partner. What I'm describing here, I didn't think my way into. I was taught it by specific people, in specific rooms, in specific moments. I'm grateful in a way I rarely say out loud. If this episode moved something in you, please share it and follow for more. Until the next time, stay open, stay honest, and stay human.